Good afternoon. I'm Holly George at the Utah Historical Society. Welcome today to our Prospective Speakers series hosted by the Historical Society. Today we are very lucky to have Dr. Farina King, a historian and author. And I want to note that after Dr. King's talk, we'll have a short question and answer period. And we ask that you just put your questions in the question box and I'll monitor those. Again, we're delighted to have Farina King today. She is a citizen of the Navajo Nation and the Horizon Chair of Native American Ecology and Culture and an Associate Professor of Native American Studies at the University of Oklahoma, which is the homelands of the Caddo and Wichita and affiliated tribes. She is the author of many books, many publications, and award-winning publications, I should note. And we're just pleased to have Farina here today. And so that we can have more time listening to her, I am going to now let Farina take the reins.
Thank you so much, Holly, and to the Utah Historical Society. It's great to follow the work that they do and the journal. So I encourage everyone, if you're not active and involved, a member of and subscriber to the journal and following the Utah Historical Society, please get involved and follow along and contribute, because there's a lot of really important work and conversations happening. And I appreciate all that Holly and Wendy have been doing, and exciting initiatives such as Utah Peoples Revisited and the National Council on Public History teaming up with folks in Utah with the UHS in April for a big conference in Salt Lake City. It's exciting. It's really wonderful. And ahiet, as we say in Diné, thank you so much. And I really am so grateful for all of you and sharing this space and those coming today to listen and engage in this conversation. I really am thankful for you. I know we all come from different places. Like I said, I'm even though my background is showing Sebi and Diné Monument Valley, where my parents lived for about 10, 12 years when my father was a practicing physician and in a Utah Navajo health system clinic there. I really grew to love that place. And my relatives there and not too far from there in the New Mexico part around Sayanichi, not too far from Gallup, actually a rock's throw from to Gallup is where some of my relatives are. So saying hello to my relatives, and I'll talk more about where I come from and the way that we are related and connected. And I just want to again thank everyone for coming and listening. So to start off, I have so many different things to say, but I will follow along with some images that I want to share with everyone, and highlights from this book. And just to double, Holly, you can see my screen okay? Because I always feel like even if I say it's good, can you see that?
Yes, it's good.
Okay.
We can see it.
Wonderful. Great. So these are some images I'll be walking through, highlighting this book that I recently wrote, and thanks so much University Press of Kansas and the Lyda Conley series on trailblazing Indigenous futures. It's the first of that series. I'm a co-editor on with Kiera Vigil and Ty Edwards and the editor David Congdon. They are all wonderful. So I hope those listening, please continue to contribute, support such series on Indigenous studies. And so it was fabulous to work with the University Press of Kansas on this book, Diné Gáamalii, Navajo Latter-day Saints Navajo Latter-day Saint experiences in the 20th century. And there's so many people who are part of this journey. I can't name all of them, but I can't not name one of them in particular, Jesse Embry, who worked with me very closely from the inception of this work. And even before I started thinking about it, the Latter-day Saint Oral History Project that she launched through the Charles Redd Center of Western Studies at Brigham Young University, focusing on Latter-day Saint Native Americans and their experiences through oral history. And then the Maxwell Institute that also helped fund this project, supporting me and my writing and work, and all the different people who reviewed this work over the years, so many who contributed to it. So I have to start off there and reiterate that. But like many of my works, there is a very personal connection for me. In many ways, these are difficult works because I know it's a perspective. It comes from a certain positionality, meaning, a particular lens and where I'm coming from. And so some people may be this already, but many may not. And that's an important part of this work too, is it's a family history. It's a story of friends and people very close to me. And as scholars often call it, ethnographic history, ethnography, and how it really comes from my own experiences and communities and circles that are very important to me, interpersonal. And so some researchers, they would never show their baby picture or a picture of their parents and siblings and their children and things like that. But I've decided to do that. And it was a hard decision. I actually was studying African history for several years because I felt very concerned and hesitated and resisted looking at my own family history and community's history for academic studies and in these intellectual conversations, because it's so personal. But then I was really struck by seeing and other academics who are not a part of these communities in the same way as I am. And I felt like it was important for me to engage in this work. So this is an image of me as a baby. I was born in Tonines Dize, and in Diné Bizad, and among our Diné relatives, we introduce ourselves by kinship, clans. So I greet, Yat Shke, Do Shudine, Do Shakis, hello to my friends and relatives. She Bilagana Nishle, Do Kia Ani Bashish Chin, Bilagana Dashache, Do Sinijani Dashanale, Akut Egot Sa Nishle. And I share, that this is where I'm coming from, where my ancestors, through our maternal line, our mothers, where they come from, that I am of white American settler descent through my mother, and born for the Towering House clan and Blackstreet Woods people of Diné, as Navajo call ourselves. And this is an image of my mother and father, Joanne and Phil, on their wedding day. They're going up for 50 years together in a month or so in the Provo Temple of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So this is in many ways tied to both my parents' stories, and they saw the whole manuscript. They've been a part of this conversation from the beginning. As I told them, I was working with oral histories of Latter-day Saints, and I asked them, to sit down with me and to have oral history, or, to do oral histories with them, like it's doing that together and talk story, essentially together, and they consented. They've looked over this work, especially my father. It's not only his story as a Diné Latter-day Saint convert, but this work, what is, I think, very complex about it is it's a culmination and an interweaving of many Diné Latter-day Saint stories together, including my own, right? Being raised by two people who joined willingly the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I Latter-day Saints. And my father, as I said, who is Diné, and my mother of a white American settler descent. And these images show, them, my parents meeting George P. Lee, who was one of the few Native Americans to rise in the hierarchies, these high levels of church leadership. And I will refer to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as the church in this conversation, because the president and current prophet recognized, by members of the church, President Nelson has been very specific in the leadership about referring to the church in its full name. And for brevity, I will say the church, and in that respect of that request as well, right? But historically, it's complicated too, because we're called Mormons and the Mormon church and that connection. But to me, it actually made sense what President Nelson requests, because in a way I've been called, and my family, my relatives have been called Indians, and who decided on that, who had these misnomers. And Mormons, did they decide to be called that? That title was also imposed on them as it was traced over time. So as I said, this is a lot of the connection between my own family stories. I want to share a piece where my dad, his conversion story is a big part of beginning the book, Diné do Gáamalii, and then highlighting different aspects of the book and my thinking about it. And then I am really excited and look forward to hearing your questions and engaging in a conversation with you. But I start the book with some background about my father, and here's some images from my father and my auntie and uncle when they are children growing up in Diné in that area, Sayanichi, Rehoboth, New Mexico, as it's also known as, and the checkerboard region around Gallup. And I'll start looking at page 3 of the introduction and just read this part and go on to talking. My father's conversion, actually it starts here. Since he was on page 2, since he was the youngest son, my father's family called him Ashki Yaje, little boy. He was born in his family's hogan, a traditional Diné dwelling, something like this one in the picture, I'll say. Behind a rocky ridge, not far from the mission site of the Rehoboth Christian Reformed Church in Diné, Navajo country, a nurse midwife from the mission hospital came to the hogan to help deliver him. My father received the names on his birth certificate from the nurse midwife, who chose Philip for his first name after one of the 12 apostles in the New Testament. Lee, the nurse's first name, became his middle name. Although many of his maternal relatives joined the Rehoboth Christian Reformed Church, Philip's family did not adhere to Christianity at home. His father was a hatathe, a Diné healer, also known as a medicine man, who hoped to transfer his knowledge and spiritual practices to Philip. Schooling exposed Philip to Christian denominations during his childhood, but he was assigned to or randomly picked a Christian religion in the way a student joins a club at school. The different denominational groups would attract children by offering the most perks, such as free food and candy. In junior high school, my dad started to work on a farm in the Teton Valley of Idaho for a Latter-day Saint family during the summers. As a young migrant worker, he developed a close relationship with the farmer Merrill Coons and his family. The family invited him to church and to read the Book of Mormon, which my father initially resisted and criticized. When Merle asked my father to read the Book of Mormon, my dad told him to read Custer Died for Your Sins first. I never found out if Merle Coons read Vine Deloria Jr.'s book, but my father eventually read the Book of Mormon. The Coons family convinced my dad when he was graduating from high school to apply to Brigham Young University after one of his school teachers also recommended its extensive language programs. Philip enjoyed learning different languages, such as German and Arabic. He enrolled at BYU as a non-member of the church in 1968. He began to believe the Book of Mormon to be another testament of Christ while studying it for a religion class taught by the dean of General College, Lester Wheaton. My dad became convinced from the Latter-day Saint teachings that Jesus Christ had come to the Americas and that Native Americans, including himself, descended from an ancient civilization of Israelite lineage and covenant people, the Lamanites. In 1969, as a BYU student, my father wanted to be baptized in the church. His decision to accept the doctrine of the church drastically changed his relationship with Shanali Hasteen, my grandfather. When he returned home to Diné to share the news of his conversion, he expected his family to celebrate since he had discovered what he considered to be the truth and happiness in the gospel. Instead of rejoicing with him, his father was outraged and disowned him, forbidding him to return home. Philip left engulfed with the heartbreak that he might never see his family again for the rest of his life. My father's conversion to the Latter-day Saint faith followed a series of events that repetitively raised challenges, which begged the question as to why he continued to participate in the church. I sought to understand what he had to gain from church membership by tracing his experiences and those of other Diné who participated in the church during the late 20th century. When my father consciously prepared for his baptism, church officials informed him that he was already baptized. All right, so I have this image right here of Gallup and about, the time going back when my dad was there. So I say, my father then remembered when missionaries of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints took him and other children from the Rhema School's dormitory for Native Americans to a movie in Gallup, New Mexico. They dunked him and some fellow dormitory school children in water after the movie, but he never understood that the missionaries had baptized them. They simply invited him to an outing. Although he was baptized then, he did not convert to the Latter-day Saint faith until college. So I continue, to give a little more into that story, and share how my father went on, to continue his time at BYU and decided to go on a mission. He was assigned to the Southwest Indian Mission that I have a chapter about, in the book, and some background and history behind that. And then I share this as a part of wrapping up the introduction, skipping to page 18. My father, Ashki Yaje, changed drastically during his mission for the church in the Navajo Nation. As he taught and sought to convert other Diné, he once felt anger and bitterness towards white settlers and the history of colonization. He has not excused or denied such histories of violence and darkness that afflicted him and our ancestors, but he began to hope for a future that unified the descendants of the colonizers, colonized, and all those in between, whatever categories and identities people assume in the history of US imperialism and expansionism that displaced and dispossessed indigenous peoples. During Ashkiyage's mission, his father asked to see him as he lay dying from cancer. Ashkiyage received permission to visit his father at the hospital, where my grandfather told him that he was sorry for casting him out of the family and accepted him as Gáamalii, a Latter-day Saint. They reconciled just before my grandfather died. Ashkiyaje is one of the few in his family to actively participate in the church, but he is still a part of his family. My father made that decision to be Diné do Gáamalii. This book shares the histories of this community and gathering and what that identity means to various people, including my father and family, during the late 20th century. I think a lot floods, a lot of emotion, a lot of thoughts flood over me when I read that, because I also shared that that story I kind of begin the book with in that introduction is in many ways my father's conversion story, of that struggle he had reconciling with his family. And as you see in the image, this is actually my father with a mission companion in the Southwest Indian Mission, and his mother, his Nama, and his mother, Johanna Haskoutsi, who was very supportive of him, actually also decided at a point to be baptized and join the church. And while he was, in the Southwest Indian Mission, sometimes he would, I think, sneak over and visit him, as this picture shows. But him talking about that strained relationship with his father, and yet also what his father means to him and his family, his he has always shared that story in since I've been growing up, at least in front of me, with tears and being really moved. So I think that also it resonates with me to think about that and to share that with you as I read it. It's very powerful for me. So yes, I've in the book addressed various writings and literature, other oral histories that people did for research projects, theses, different things. So this quote actually came from a project looking at like dynamics of the Indian student placement program. Also another chapter, the theme, is an important part of the book in a chapter. And this is an unnamed elder who was interviewed and quoted by Hal Taylor, and in the kind of literature research being done, And it was a Diné elder who was asked, I mean, there basically was this question in a research project, and Hal Taylor was one of the mission presidents of that Southwest mission, Indian mission. And when he met this elder, Hal Taylor recounts, this is again through filters, and actually most of the book is based on oral histories directly with Diné who identify as Latter-day Saint. So that's, I think, something to point out with this work, is there's a lot of different Diné perspectives and a lot of different Latter-day Saint perspectives, or people who have some history, personal background, entanglements with Mormonism. And it's all very complex, and there's not only one. But so this is a woman asked about what religion means to Diné. And she emphasizes that for Diné, like, being Diné is in a sense a religion. It's born in your heart. And if Diné would join any other church, it was to just, get by and appease other people, and not really who they are. And these are thoughts, and different perspectives that are circulating and very central and foundational to understanding what, these different religious experiences, what is spirituality as Diné. Here's an image of my father as a young boy. So circling back to what I read, I also, talking to my father, constantly learn more and more, and not just my father. I've talked to relatives, close friends who are family to me, the family you make along the way, and people I didn't know very well, and referring to oral histories that other people did. So some people have passed away before I could ever meet them. But circling back to how my father found out he was actually baptized before he ever consented, or his parents even knew, as a young boy, it showed, some of these complexities, and that's what I try not to shy away from, and to emphasize, is that it's not all this binary of here's all these good or bad experiences in the church. But someone like my father and different people I talk to, they have a lot of critical experiences in the church, and ones that they are critical of, right? That my father, when he finds out, or when he decides and learns about the church on his own terms, and he finds out he was already baptized, and thinking, that's what that was, when they took us to the movie and baptized us afterwards, and he still decides to associate with that church. Why and what's going on? And then even more, experiences after that he is constantly questioning, questioning these experiences and what they mean, and how he affiliates, and the decisions he makes. And I say that about him just more broadly, but there were other people also in the similar kind of dynamics that I was meeting and talking to, and communities, right? That there are some people, when I interviewed them for oral histories that I did in the 2000s, especially like going into, I think it was 2007, 2008, some of them are no longer active in the church, or no longer want to identify as Latter-day Saint today. So that's something I also, try to point out, is it's not just a static experience either, but what's happening in all these dynamics. Mainly, I'm looking at this critical period that I call, quote, Lamanite era, with church leadership influenced by Spencer W. Kimball, who was a prophet and president of the church and a very active, proactive, leader as an apostle and in various capacities and roles. And that Kimball was a major advocate for this idea of celebrating Indigenous peoples as Lamanites, even while, he had articulated these ideas that certainly went in line with all the issues of racism, and racial constructs and ideas that were very prevalent of his time in the late, 1960s into 1980s, about the time he passed, right? So images of showing that. And while, the church, even from its foundings and origins, presents the Book of Mormon and to Native American communities, and also how they're understanding it of, a book of ancient peoples of the Americas, and that Lamanite became synonymous for Native Americans and American Indians through the way different teachings were propagated, and all these different aspects. I'm trying to trace and understand not necessarily as much what white American Latter-day Saints believed and their frameworks. Of course, I'm looking at that in the book to understand how it affected Native Americans and what were the impacts, and what did Native Americans, specifically Diné Latter-day Saints, think of those ideas and how it was, affecting them directly. I was more concerned, not, maybe that's not the right word, but more attentive, really trying to be centered more on Diné understandings and epistemologies of the world, and where Diné are coming from, of ideas of zodizin, dosin, prayer and song, and that in Diné Bazad, there's not really a word for these direct translations for what, the English connotations are of religion. And so there was a lot of actually translation work in this, in these studies too, because language and teachings and ways of knowing and seeing the world, they are interlocked, they're entangled, intertwined. And so that's what I was also trying to better understand, which is hard from where I'm coming from, because that was what my father was immersed in through, his parents and his grandparents. But then he actually made a decision in his life to take a new direction with his family and his posterity, his children, me, including me, right? And what the impacts are of that as we think about it. So those are images that, these next images are introducing people who may be less familiar with, well, what are Diné foundational teachings and ways of viewing the world, understanding the universe. And it's certainly, you can't talk about that without understanding, trying to understand, because there are layers, of complexity and meaning to being Diné, such as the foundational teachings of Sanagai Bikehajo and the Beauty Way teachings, as they are, roughly translated. But when we say beauty, it's not the superficial sense of beauty, it's harmony, joy, order of the world. And I love the work of Will Smith Jr., for example, this quote that I referred to in other works, and following and incredible Diné intellectuals and philosophers such as Araneth, that he said, and I hope my internet is pulling through, so thank you for bearing with me. Araneth said, these sacred mountains are our thinking, our knowledge, and our ways of life. Ina, we as the Diné can use our psychological mind and common sense to see these sacred mountains, lands, valleys, rivers, trees, old hogans, old trails, to understand our stories of the past, present, and even the future. So in my first book, The Earth Memory Compass, Diné landscape and education in the 20th century, I do what I can to develop a book and a framework that follows, these central Diné teachings, even in the way that we think about organizing our writing and our thoughts. They're intertwined and modeled by Diné educational systems, sovereign education, such as Diné College. And this is from the cover painting by Totsoni, is the artist who painted this, of the 4 sacred mountains, 4 directions of Diné. And there's not just 4, but those are often the mountains focused on. And I just reiterate that there's so much more complexities of sacred landscapes and meanings. And that is a part of also, they're all interwoven, they're all linked with Sa Nagaibik Ehajon, is this relationship of people, land, ecologies, more than human, as you see animals, horse and turtle, and all these that are a part of what it means, to be Diné, the people, and who we are. So what happens then when you have Diné in particularly the period I'm looking at after the 1950s, hearing teachings from individuals like President of the church then, Spencer W. Kimball, or at the time, some of them hearing him speak, he was an apostle, they're hearing followers of that advocacy for emphasizing Native Americans as Lamanites, or other teachings of the church about Jesus Christ and the Book of Mormon and all these different things. I think about this example of Arlene Nachezi Williams, which is encapsulating that she wrote. She's a songwriter who also was one of the co-writers of the song Go My Son, which also became really popular beyond the BYU setting and other areas. I think I've heard like different schools singing this as well. But she wrote this song, I Walk in Beauty. And she was a Diné student at Brigham Young University at this like heyday where BYU had one, especially the time my dad was there and around that time, they had arguably one of the largest Native American student populations in the country, mainly because of all the programs and resources and the energy under the leadership and tied to the leadership of Kimball and those years. These were all these ideas of Lamanite programs, of seeing Lamanites as, quote, blossoming as the rose, and that they would be the leaders of Zion, of this great resurgence of Indigenous peoples, even while it's intertwined with racist ideologies at the time of dark skin and curse, these ideas of curses of dark skin for some Latter-day Saints, and actually a lot of white Latter-day Saints who adhered to these interpretations and beliefs. So it's really messy that there's these cognitive dissonance and contradictions of, teaching Native Americans to be proud to be Lamanite, while there also are underlying interpretations and beliefs that Lamanite were people who were cursed and fallen and needed to be saved. particularly, by Gentiles or white Americans, some understanding it that way. But through all that, what is actually happening on the ground, coming back to this song, I Walk in Beauty by Arlene Nachezi Williams, is she writes a song that I learned and would hear other Diné Latter-day Saints sing, saying, I walk in beauty, yes, I do, yes, I do. I talk in beauty, yes, I do, yes, I do. I sing in beauty just for you, and only you. And also brings in Diné kind of chant-like parts to it. Hey, ya na, hey, ya na, hey, ne, ya na, hey, ya, hey, yo, hey, ya, hey, yo. So she mixes these kind of chants into it. And then this is drawing from that teaching of Sana Gaibik Hishon, which I never fully translated for people. Some people may already have a background, but it has roughly been translated as to walk in beauty, but it's a lot more, as I said, complex than that, right? To live a long life in happiness. It's had all these kind of different translations, but she's saying in English that words that are evoking that prayer and those teachings. And she writes this music, beginning and is involved in these, quote, Lamanite communities of Native American students. And she's a Diné student, meeting people, as in this picture. There's Vicky there in the middle, who was Miss Indian BYU, who I believe was from the Native nations that are based in Oklahoma. I think Comanche off the bat, or I might have to double check that. But she's meeting students from all these different Native nations and communities. So I also delve into Red Power at BYU, which, yes, there was absolutely Red Power, because it's a part of what are all these different experiences on the ground from these various programs that can have their own agendas of the architects who design them? And what do people like Arlene, my father, Phil, and even me, right? How are we on the ground living and navigating and experiencing and interpreting, understanding all these different programs and ideas about the universe and the world, and ways that people hybridize them, they tie them, they perform, or they're, just going along with motions and then rejecting different ideas and teachings. These are things that I delve into in this book and share. But mainly, more than anything, and there's so much to share, but I want to be sure we have time to talk, why I do this work. And it's hard. This book, I think I have a lot of mixed feelings about. I love it. I knew I wanted to do it, and committed to that. But I will say that the foreword, written by Patty Limerick, it really finally was the push to say this can happen, this book can happen. And how Patty looked at my work and the way that she talked about it, because she understood what I was grappling with, that even if I mention being Native American and being affiliated, that I was raised Latter-day Saint, it opens up Pandora's box. It opens up the can of worms with different people, and the way that they have perspectives, opinions, or personal experiences about these groups and identities, and people who have judged me, or they have their prejudices about Diné, about Native Americans. And on top of that is compounded with, groups who have their prejudice and ideas about Mormons or, Latter-day Saints. And so it's just all, combined there. And so even if I just mention the word, Mormon or Latter-day Saints, or that I study it with some people, they all of a sudden suspect me of trying to convert them, or like have all these ideas telling me how my family is. And I have on and on stories about that. And I also experienced that as a Diné woman too, of ideas that people have of who are Diné and how they should be. And this is from all sides of it, even internally among Latter-day, those who identify as Latter-day Saint, and those who identify as Native American, and those who identify as Diné. So it's just all these facets. So it is really hard work, to open up and share very personal stories. But I felt like the reason why I do it, it's really, hard to say. We are human beings can be so cruel to each other as we watch on the news and see all these things. So why I do this is we really come to know each other by our stories. And hopefully, take the time and open our hearts to just listen and understand where people have been and where they're coming from. It's really hard because it's scary. What my own children are hearing, facing in school, see children around the world going through and suffering. So having what we call these interfaith conversations and work to just seek how we can all have beauty, in our lives. Hajo, whatever you believe, whatever, you come from and you want to do, that's love, that we can listen and try to understand one another, to treat each other as relatives, to really be good relatives to each other. And I know with all these different groups, that is a common teaching I see in all of them, is be a good relative. So it's no longer these binaries of, well, Mormons or Latter-day Saints are like this, or Diné are like this, or these Native Americans are like this, but it's like who we are. Who are we as a human being, as a relative, and how are we treating people? And I hope it also affects, yes, on big scale, policies that can help, or any ways that community can really be treating each other with respect and understanding where they are. Yeah, that's why, I do this work. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And I look forward to the conversations and hearing from you all.
Thank you, Farina. Thank you. That was very powerful. Yeah, I will echo what you said, that we do our work so that people will treat each other as relatives and that we learn from each other's stories. Thank you. I will open it up to Q&A now. We have 10 minutes, and I want to start first with Claudia Loyosa. That Grandma Williams is her family. I loved seeing that. We have a really good question from Val Edwards. He asks, how has your father's conception of his Lamanite, quote, Lamanite heritage changed over the course of his life?
Yeah. There's constant changes too. While I focus on my approach is historical, of like, okay, what were they believing at this time? Well, oral history is just so awesome too, because I talked to him years after something happens, and then even that oral history, it was recorded, in a certain year at a certain time. So certainly there's changes in all these over all these years and periods of his life. But so it's hard for me to know what was he saying, what was he believing about it when he was in his 20s for example, or before he was a father, and all these things. So I know more, how he's articulating and conceptualizing that idea of what is he Lamanite or not. But my sense of it, just talking to him over all these years, and it's been years now with this project and work, is that he did say, he put it this way, because this is a work that I'm continuing actually, of what are Indigenous perspectives of the meaning of Lamanite, because there's a lot of discourse, or there's some scholarship about that, but not coming from Indigenous peoples themselves that have been historically identified as Lamanite, or they have identified as Lamanite themselves. And so this is a collaborative work I'm doing with Dr. Michael Ng, and we're working towards an edited volume with a lot of different contributors from all kinds of backgrounds and community ties that they have. So again, I'm really thinking about this a lot. But with my dad, I think what he said, which was really interesting to me, is he said something to the effect of, they told us, we're Lamanite, and be proud, you're Lamanite, and really, bolstering that. And he says, then all of a sudden, and I think he's talking when he says they, he's referring to like church officials and leadership and messages that were conveyed to him. So I think like that was resonating with him and certain people, when they were younger, hearing that in these kind of programs, like at BYU, or as I heard from different people I met or read in sources about the Indian student placement program, which I didn't even, have a chance to get into in this talk. But that, yeah, it was emphasized there, with these, and they had Indian seminaries, like these seminary programs. So he's saying, they were really hammering that, like that was emphasized big time for the youth. And it was framed, though, as a positive thing, like empowering and supposed to be something, like I said, to be proud of. And then the church and church officials step back, and they're moving away, and even to the present are very hesitant, not saying anything. And there's been some, changes to even wording in various documents, technically the Book of Mormon itself, right? And the title page, for example, that I talk about in the book. So they are stepping back, and then those who remember, like my father, they remember and they've seen these changes over time. They're like, what is this about? What is going on? And it's quite a spectrum, though, because I think it really depends on how people were affected by the use and interpretations of Lamanite. What I mean by that is there's been people who have been really hurt, toxic relationships by Latter-day Saints who appropriated Lamanite to emphasize or tell Native Americans that they're cursed, that they're less than, or something like that. And then there's others who have heard it influenced in a way of like, no, you're the cream of the crop, you're the best, you're our leaders, you're so blessed. And this, like, that variance too of how people are, who wants to identify as Lamanite or not, and the different reactions when that word is brought up among Indigenous communities. And something I will say also about my father, that he was adamant about, because some people, they were told by certain Latter-day Saints, especially like white Latter-day Saints, that, oh, you're going to become whiter. You're going to turn whiter because, that's the lift of a curse, like this idea is told to them. And my father said he never thought being Lamanite or joining the church would ever make him whiter or anything. And there's certain Diné Latter-day Saints and other Latter-day Saints too, who they never thought that. And if somebody said that, they just we're automatically skeptical about that and threw that under. So it is something that changes. And yet, I can tell, I think my father is more hesitant to say, well, even though my father's more hesitant to say like, oh, he identifies as Lamanite. I think that's, been changing. There are others who are very vocal and actually quite adamant that they identify as Lamanite. When I say other Native Americans, yeah.
Oh, thank you. We have two other really good, really good heavy hitting questions. We got 3 minutes. Connell O'Donovan asks, is there a way for me as a white historian to respect Diné beliefs and practices, but also to refer to deceased Diné in history by name? Or should I not use their names and find a way around that?
Whoa. So that, yeah, this brings up, these important questions that get at just even doing Diné, the work of history and engaging with Native American communities. Importantly, even though I am a Navajo Nation citizen and I'm Diné, through my relations, who I am, I'm learning constantly how important it is to, and I hope my connection is stable. I get the sign it's unstable. But anyway, I constantly have to learn the protocols of what community you're working with and living with. So even while you're doing history, think of history as living, even when those people are deceased. What community are they from? Who are their relatives? Have you, research that or have a sense of connecting with them and learning about the protocols of that community? If it's oral history work, we have to consider, I had to connect with the Navajo Nation Historic Preservation Office and previous work where I did oral histories, Navajo Nation. I worked with the Navajo Nation Human Research Review Board. So Navajo Nation is very organized and has various programs and departments where these protocols are being written out quite clearly. And so it's important, to look that up, and any Native nation or community that you're working with, do the best to understand, like, know those communities. And when you are building those relationships, because when you're studying, and planning to write anything or publish anything about those communities, it is essential, even if you're studying like 18th century, so long ago, it's still affecting those communities because you're writing something that will be associated with them, and it could be about their ancestors, And so I think your question, I can't answer that because I don't know which group, which sources you're talking about. And it does depend, there's Diné in different communities. There's now Diné, like a really strong enclave of Diné in the Phoenix area. Diné are very diverse and all over Diné Bikaya, Diné in Monument Valley, Diné in where my family's from, parts around Crown Point, New Mexico. They also are diverse. And so, but there are ways, what I'm trying to say, there are ways that there's chapter house communities. Sometimes it's the project you're doing is very personal about someone's specific ancestor. So trying to learn who are the family to at least make them aware of the work you're doing, and that's, the least thing. Hopefully you can work with them because a lot of people, they don't have accessibility to some of the sources that researchers have, and they may not know how to find it, even when it's online. And it can be hard, to search these databases. And so where's the reciprocity in your work? Why are you doing it, and how can it support and be something to share with the community and be guided by learning, building relationships with them that are healthy. So that's a whole nother conversation, but it's really important in Native American and Indigenous studies, whether it's history or literature or anything. So I strongly recommend, familiarizing yourself with Native American and Indigenous studies, different sources that, even my book refers to, that you can read those that help you to learn about how to approach and understand, what's appropriate, what's not, because it's really about learning from the communities themselves, because they vary. No group is the same. Like even when people are talking about NAGPRA and the effort to repatriate Native remains and things, there's some Native nations that want the remains of their people returned, absolutely. But there's some that's actually not their way either. So it's just completely depends, on those specific protocols of each community, and no community is exactly the same. So that's the first step, to try and identify which community you're talking about. And I think historians, any researchers, we get into a habit of talking generically because we're, maybe talking in big breaths or whatever you, talking about Native Americans, when actually when I'm saying that, it can mean like so many different peoples, and it helps to hone in on that specificity when we can more.
Oh, Farina, this is so good. I'm afraid we have to end, but
I know.
there are a lot of comments we can't get to. I'm copying them. I'm going to send them to Farina so she gets your messages. Farina, I think I'm echoing the comments, and certainly what I'm thinking. Thank you. Thank you for your courage in writing and sharing these perspectives. Thank you for leading with your heart. I just feel like we've really had a gift to learn from you. And I'll just close by saying, treat each other as relatives. That's how we need to live in this world. So thank you, Dr. King. That was lovely.
Thank you for having me with you today. And I hope you all get a chance to read the book, and then, continue the conversations. There's a lot here. It's not just, it's not the only story. There's so many others. So that's the biggest thing for me, is supporting others and sharing their stories. And that, yeah, it's beautiful work. It really touches me.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you all for attending today. And for your comments.